In the autumn of 1883, in the hill country where the Osage River carved its way through the limestone bluffs of central Missouri, a woman named Della Croft stood at the edge of a property she no longer owned and looked at the one across the road she had just bought for $2. The auctioneer had called it a mercy sale. He had said the old Harker mill was a ruin, roof gone on one end, the mill race choked with 20 years of silt and poplar seedlings, the great stone dormant so long that moss had crept up its face in a green tie. He said whoever bought it would be buying debt in the form of a building. He said this with the mild cheerfulness of a man who expected no serious bidders and wanted to be home for supper. Della had raised her hand. The auctioneer had looked at her the way men looked at her that autumn, with a mixture of pity and impatience, and asked if she understood the terms. She said she did. She paid $2 from a thin envelope, received a deed written on county paper, and walked across the road to the mill her father had ground his grain against for 30 years, and which his rival, Jasper Ault, had bought out from under the Croft family when Della's father lay dying and could not fight the foreclosure. She did not look back at the house. If you have ever watched a woman walk toward something others have written off, stay with this story. What Della Croft found inside that mill was not what anyone expected, including Della herself. Leave a word below about the thing in your own life that looked like nothing until you looked closer. The Croft family had come to this bend of the river in 1851 when Della's grandfather hauled a millstone overland from St. Pan, Louis, a wagon with iron-bound wheels that left ruts still faintly visible in the old trace road. He built the mill first and the house second, reasoning that a man who could grind his neighbor's grain would always have neighbors worth having. The reasoning proved sound. The Croft mill sat at the natural choke point where 3 townships converged, and for 30 years it was the only grist operation within reasonable hauling distance. The nearest alternative was an 18-mile round trip across a road that flooded twice a year, and so the Croft mill ground what the valley grew without much competition and without much complaint. Della's father, Thomas Croft, had inherited the mill at 22 and run it with the systematic care of a man who understood that a mill was a machine before it was a building, and that machines required attention rather than affection to stay right. He kept a log of every adjustment in a brown ledger, noting the date, the condition of the face he had found, the depth of the harps he had cut, and the test result he had run on the first measure of grain after each dressing. He had kept this log for 23 years by the time he fell ill, and its entries were as regular as heartbeats. Thomas had also inherited the craft of millstone dressing from his own father, and this was the thing he taught Della before he taught her to read. She was 4 years old when he first put her hand on a dressed stone, let her feel the shallow furrows her grandfather had cut into the surface, the lands between them flat and true, the whole face angled at a pitch so slight it was measured in fractions of an inch per foot. He called the furrows the harps. He said the harps sang the grain through. He said a stone that was not properly dressed would smear the flour rather than cut it, would heat the meal and kill the germ, and that a miller who could not dress his own stones was not a miller but only a man standing near a machine someone else had made. By the time Della was 12, she could feel the face of a runner stone with her bare palm and tell him where the high spots were. By 15, she could dress a pair of millstones with a mill bill and a rinding staff without supervision, cutting the harps to within a 64th of an inch of true, beveling the land so the dressed stone would sling spent meal outward, while fresh grain came down the eye. It was not a common skill. Most millers hired it out when the stone wore, bringing in a dresser who came and went and left a bill for his day's work. Thomas Croft had learned it from his father and taught it to Della because she had the hands for it and the patience, and because he believed that a trade skill carried in the body was the only kind of wealth that could not be foreclosed. He was not wrong about that. He was simply too ill in the winter of 1879 to make full use of what he had understood. Jasper Alt had owned the Croft Mill for 4 years when Thomas died. He had come to the valley 10 years before Thomas's death, built a newer operation 2 miles upstream, and competed quietly, and then, not so quietly, for the same customers. His mill had a steel roller attachment, modern for the time, and he used it as a reason to undersell the old stone-ground operation. When Thomas fell ill in the winter of 1879, Alt had approached the family's creditors rather than the family, and by the time Thomas understood what was happening, there was a lien instrument signed by the county land office and a foreclosure date in the spring records. The house went first because it was a separate parcel. The mill went second because the mill's note carried the greater sum. Della and her mother moved to a room above the dry goods store in Calder's Crossing, and Alt's name went on the deed that had held Thomas Croft's name for 31 years. The neighbors who had brought their grain to the Croft Mill twice a year, for as long as anyone could remember, did not stop coming. They simply redirected to the 8 operation upstream without, for the most part, saying anything directly to Della about it. She did not expect them to say anything. She had watched her father run the mill long enough to understand that proximity and convenience were the engines of loyalty, not sentiment. Her mother died the following winter. The cause the doctor listed was respiratory, but Della understood it more plainly as a woman who had lost the anchoring structure of her life and found nothing available in the room above the dry goods store to replace it. She was buried in the Calder's Crossing churchyard beside 2 children who had not survived their first winters. And Della put a field stone at the grave because the churchyard charge for a carved marker was beyond what the seamstress work had accumulated so far. Aunt ran the Croft Mill for 3 more years with hired men and then let it go still. When a flash flood in the spring of 1882 tore out the lower quarter of the mill race, and he judged the repair too costly, he opened a second roller operation in a town 12 miles north and left the old stone mill to close up the county, had assessed it for back taxes twice, and received nothing. In September of 1883, it went to public auction on the steps of the Calder's Crossing Courthouse in Della, who had spent 3 years working as a seamstress and saving the money to do exactly this, raised her hand and paid $2 for the thing Jasper Alt had not wanted enough to keep. The auctioneer's joke, as she walked away with the deed, was that she now owned the finest moss collection in 3 counties. The men around him laughed. Della did not turn around. She had been holding this particular patience for 3 years, and she had enough of it left to carry her across the road. The mill was worse inside than the exterior suggested. The roof had failed at the north end, and 3 winters of ice and rain had buckled the upper floor so that it listed toward the missing corner. The floorboards sprung and blackened at the joints. The wooden machinery, the hopper and the vat and the feed shoe had rotted to a state where the wood separated in layers when pressed, the tenons pulling free of the mortises under their own weight. The mill race gate was seized with rust, and there was no water coming through. The channel behind the gate held a thicket of poplar volunteers, and a yard of silt and leaf pack compacted into something that had the consistency of old felt. The great wooden wheel, an overshot wheel of 12-foot diameter that had driven the stones for 30 years under Thomas Croft and 3 more under Alt's hired men, had lost 6 paddles entirely, and the remaining ones were cupped and checked and would not hold water long enough to transfer power. Della walked the floor twice without speaking. She had brought 1 lantern and the canvas bag her father had carried to every dressing job, which held his mill bills, his rinding staff, his proving ring, and the small steel straight edge he had called his honest measure. She had carried this bag in her room above the dry goods store for 3 years, taking it down and oiling the tools twice a year so they would not rust in the damp air of the back room. The bag smelled of linseed oil and old canvas, and the particular mineral dust that millstone dressing produces, a smell she associated specifically with her father's forearms in summer, when he worked the stone without his coat and came in at midday with pale stone dust to his elbows and his hair damp from the effort. The millstones were intact. She had known they might be. Stone does not rot. The runner stone sat on the bedstone where it always had the spindle seized, but the stones themselves uncracked, their faces hidden under 4 years of settled dust in the dry husks of insects. She set the lantern on the edge of the stone vat and looked at them for a long moment. The banding hoops that held the French burr sections together were surface rusted, but structurally sound. The balance rend was in place. The stone itself was massive and patient and indifferent to everything that had happened in the mill around it, which was, Della thought, the stone's single greatest virtue. There was work here that would take weeks. The race had to be cleared before any water could turn the wheel, and the wheel itself needed new paddles before it could carry power to the stone. The floor above needed bracing, or the machinery weight could not be trusted to it. There was no hopper, no bolting cloth, no meal bin. She had $2 left in the world and a deed and a bag of tools. She started with the mill race. For the first 9 days, she worked the channel alone, cutting poplar saplings at the root with a hatchet and dragging them out by hand, then shoveling silt into a cart she borrowed from a farmer named Olin Bates, who lived a quarter-mile down the road and who had watched her arrive at the mill on the first morning with the expression of a man unsure whether to offer help or condolence. He offered the cart without comment, which was, Della understood, the practical version of condolence available to a man of his type. He did not ask what she planned. He lent the cart and went back to his morning. She filled and emptied the cart 14 times on the first day and 11 times on the second, when her arms began to feel the accumulated resistance of the previous day's work. She slept on a pallet she had brought in her own wagon, and ate bread and dried meat, and drank from the well near the mill's foundation. The channel work was not glamorous, and it was not quick, but it had the virtue of being entirely within her competence to execute, and she found, as she had found before in difficult seasons, that difficulty of the physical kind was a more manageable variety than the others. On the 6th day, Olin Bates came down the road on his own and looked at the cleared channel from the bank for a moment. He was a man of 63, broad-shouldered, still, but with a deliberate movement of someone who had learned to allocate his effort carefully over a long life of physical work. He had a knuckle on his right hand that had been broken and set poorly, and which Della had noticed him flex against the cold that morning. He looked at the channel and then at Della and said, without preamble, that he had helped Thomas Croft set the mill race gate 20 years ago, and he supposed he remembered how the pins were fitted. "The pins are seized," Della said. "I expect they are," he said. He came down off the bank. He worked alongside her for the following 2 weeks without being asked back, saying little, eating his lunch on a flat stone at the channel's edge, and what he said was usually about the work itself, rather than about Della or her situation or what people in Calder's Crossing were saying about a woman spending her last money on a ruined mill. He was not, Della concluded, a man who found other people's circumstances interesting enough to comment on. He found the work itself interesting. That was sufficient grounds for partnership. The mill race gate came free, with oil and a cold chisel, and Olin's knowledge of the pin arrangement, which was a non-standard fitting Thomas Croft's father had devised to allow the gate to be adjusted without removing it from the channel. Olin could describe the fitting from memory, the sequence of pins, and the order of their removal, and he walked Della through it, with the patience of a man who had stored this information for 20 years against some unnamed eventual use. Water entered the channel on the 14th day, thin at first and then steady, brown with disturbed silt, and then clearing as the bottom settled. It was not enough flow to turn a wheel yet, but it was water in the channel, and Della stood in it to her boot tops in the cold October air and felt the current press against her legs and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. The wheel paddles took another week. She could not afford new lumber, and so she salvaged what she could from the rotted floor section above, pulling boards that had not yet separated entirely and trimming them with a draw knife to the paddle dimensions she had memorized from watching her father replace them as a child. The work required her to climb inside the wheel frame and fit each paddle by hand, working from a precarious board platform above the waterline. 6 paddles from salvaged floorboards, 6 more from a pile of split rails behind the mill that Olt's hired men had left. The work was rough, and the paddles were not matched in thickness, but when she hung them and opened the gate to let the water begin to push, the wheel turned. It turned, slowly, protesting, the shaft groaning in its wooden bearings. The wheel was not balanced, and it wobbled through the first 3 revolutions, with a sound that made Olen, watching from the bank, wince perceptibly. But it turned. On the 4th revolution, the bearing found its seat and the wobble reduced. By the 10th revolution, the rhythm had steadied to something that a person with charitable judgment might call functional. She had known the stones were intact. She had not known until she swept the dust from the runner stone's face on the 3rd week and pressed her palm to it the way her father had taught her that the stone had not been dressed in 4 years, and perhaps longer. Alt's hired men had not known how to dress millstone, and they had not understood that the failure to dress it was the reason the operation had become unprofitable. The face was glazed where the grain had polished it smooth, the harps worn to shallow ghost lines that could barely be felt under a fingertip, the lands high where they should have been low. A stone in that condition ground nothing correctly. It smeared rather than cut, heated the meal through friction, killed the germ, and produced a grade of flour that no careful housewife would buy twice. Thomas Croft would have addressed it before his first run of the season. Alt's men had simply run the stone until the customers complained, and then reported to Alt that the operation was unprofitable, which was true, and which had a cause they were not equipped to name. The dressing took 4 days. She worked from the edge of the stone toward the center, sitting on a wooden brace she had placed across the vat, using her father's mill bill to deepen the harps to their proper angle, and his rinding staff to check the face for high spots. The bill rang against the stone in short, precise strokes, a sound she had not heard since she was 15 years old, helping her father with the spring dressing. It echoed off the stone walls of the mill with a clarity that surprised her each time, as if the building had been waiting for exactly this particular noise and was glad to hold it again. She worked in the mornings when the light came through the east window and laid itself flat across the stone's face, which was the way her father had taught her to time the dressing, saying that flat light showed the high spots, the way no lamp could. She would work until midday when the direct light left the face, and then do other work through the afternoon, and return to the stone in the slant of the late western light, which showed the deepened harps at an angle that allowed her to judge their depth and uniformity. It was a rhythm she had learned by observation, rather than instruction, watching how Thomas organized his dressing days. Without being told, there was a system to it. There was always a system. The system was his, and she had absorbed it the way a child absorbs the grammar of a language, completely, and without being taught the rules. On the second day of dressing, 2/3 of the way through the process of clearing the harps on the runner stone's outer quarter, her bill struck something that was not stone. She stopped. The blow had been unremarkable in force, a standard dressing stroke at the proper angle, but the return sensation through the bill's handle had been wrong. Not the singing resistance of dressed millstone, which came back through the handle as a kind of firm musical clarity, a vibration that she had always associated privately with the stone's way of acknowledging correct treatment. Something denser, something that rang rather than deadened. She set the bill down and pressed her palm to the face of the stone at the spot where the stroke had landed. The dust had risen and resettled in the flat morning light. She could not see a difference, but she could feel one. The surface here was different, not in its level, which was consistent with the surrounding lands, but in its material composition under the thin outer skin of dressed stone. She took her father's honest measure and ran it across the face in 3 passes, checking for variation in the level and in the surface resistance. The face was true. Whatever was there was not a surface phenomenon, and it was not a flaw in the stone's composition. Millstone burr did not vary this way internally. French burr was cellular and consistent in its density, which was the property that made it superior to domestic stone for grinding. What she had felt was a different material entirely, present beneath the minimal surface layer of the stone's outer edge, where the harp she had been cutting ran into the iron banding hoop that encircled the entire face. She picked up the lantern and held it close and looked at the face of the runner stone with the attention she had been trained to give it. The millstone was a French burr, her father's purchase from a St. Louis dealer in 1858, assembled from fitted blocks of freshwater quartz, cemented with plaster of Paris, and banded with iron hoops to hold the composition under the centrifugal force of running. French burr stones were the finest in common use, prized for their natural cutting surface, their cellular face that kept sharp without dressing as readily as the softer domestic stones. Thomas Croft had paid a considerable sum for this pair, and he had spoken of them rarely, which was his way of indicating respect for a tool that had earned its price. She looked at the outer edge of the runner stone where the harp she had been dressing met the iron banding hoop. The hoop was original, in place, seated properly, but beneath it, in the 2-inch gap between the hoop's lower edge and the stone's dressed face, she could see, in the lantern's direct light, a line that was not a joint line between the burr sections, which she knew well and which ran at different angles. This line was horizontal, deliberate, fitted with precision. It was a seam in the iron itself, or rather a seam between the iron hoop and something fitted to its inner face. She understood then what she was looking at, or rather what she was looking at the edge of. She set the lantern on the brace board and worked her thumbnail into the seam. The fit was precise, and the gap was minimal. But after a moment, she felt the section move, not the hoop, which was fixed and solid. Something inlaid behind the hoop, a curved panel of iron shaped to match the inner face of the banding, painted or simply rusted to invisibility from any distance beyond a handspan. She could not get purchase with her thumbnail. She went to her father's bag and found the smallest of his bill irons, a narrow pointing tool he used for detail work near the eye of the stone, and worked the tip into the seam with slow, careful pressure. The panels swung out on a pin hinge no wider than a nail. It was perhaps 7 inches wide and 4 inches tall, shaped to the curve of the stone's outer band, and the recess behind it was cut into the stone itself, following that curve, sealed from the mill's interior by the iron panel, and visible in its full dimension only to someone standing at the stone's edge, with a lamp and the knowledge to look. The hollow was dry. It had been sealed well enough that the years of damp had not reached it, and the interior of the stone, which was cold to the touch, had preserved what was inside from the expansion and contraction of heat. Inside the recess there were papers wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped them on the floor of the mill with the lantern between her knees and read them in the order they were folded. Her hands were entirely steady. She had not, in her life, been a woman given to external demonstrations of internal states, and what she felt reading her father's handwriting on the first sheet was something she had no name for, and did not need to name. She read the documents as facts rather than as feelings, and she kept them in that register throughout. The first was a survey map. Her father's name was on it, and beside it a line of measurements she recognized as the river boundary of the Croft property as it had been recorded in 1851 when her grandfather filed the original plat. The boundary ran along the high water mark of the Osage River's south bend. But the line her grandfather had drawn on this survey, in his own hand and initialed at 3 stations, extended the property past the high water mark and onto the near bank itself, including a band of land 12 feet wide and 300 yards long along the river's south edge. The strip was above the spring flood line. It was flat. It was legally distinct from the riparian right and had been claimed as dry upland rather than river margin. The second document was a copy of the county plat record as filed by Jasper Alt's land agent in 1880, the year after the foreclosure. In the Alt filing, the river boundary was drawn at the high water mark. The 12-foot strip did not exist in the old version. It had been removed from the plat between Thomas Croft's original survey and Alt's refiling, and the removal was not noted or explained anywhere in the county record. The two documents were otherwise nearly identical in their measurements and notations, which made the single omission more visible to a careful eye than a wholesale revision would have been. The third document was a letter in her father's handwriting, dated 4 months before his death, addressed to a county surveyor named Marsh. It described the boundary discrepancy in plain terms, named the measurements at each station, and stated that Thomas Croft believed the 12-foot strip along the river had been excised from his recorded plat by alteration of the filed survey, and that this strip, Dop 10, which sat above the spring flood line and carried a coal seam visible in the riverbank cut where the limestone had fractured and exposed the vein, had been the reason for the approach to his creditors rather than the reason given publicly, which was unpaid interest on a milling note. He had not been able to fight the foreclosure from a sick bed. He had not known, writing the letter, whether he would live to send it. He had known the mill. He had known its stones. He had put the evidence where only a person who understood millstone dressing would find it, and he had trusted that the right hands would eventually reach the stone. She sat on the floor of the mill for some time without moving. The lantern burned steadily in the still air. Outside the mill, she could hear the wheel turning in the channel, the low, persistent rhythm of water moving through a mechanism that had not turned in 2 years before she rebuilt it. The coal seam was not a certainty she could act on by herself. The documents were her father's, but they were her father's private copies, and the alteration of the original county plat would need to be demonstrated by someone with the standing and the method to compare the two records directly and formally. She was a woman with a $2 deed and a bag of mill tools, and now a hidden recess in a millstone and 3 documents in oilcloth. What she needed was a surveyor who was not in Alt's interest and a land office willing to pull 2 decades of plat filings and set them side by side. What she had was Olen Bates. She did not show him the papers that evening. She went to his farm in the early dark and asked him a question instead. She asked him whether he had been present at her grandfather's original survey of the river boundary in 1851. He looked at her across his kitchen table with the stillness of a man who has been asked something he had been waiting a long time to be asked, and said that he had been 15 years old that summer and that he had helped carry the surveying chain for a man named Aldous, who came out from the county seat with a transit and a daybook and a methodical patience that had impressed him. He said the line had gone to the bank edge and included a good flat piece above the flood mark that Thomas's grandfather had argued for because the bank cut showed coal coming through the limestone in a clean dark line, and that Aldous had measured it at 3 stations and initialed the map at each. He initialed it at 3 stations, Della said. He did. She showed him the documents in the lamplight. He read them without speaking, handling the oilcloth wrapper with a deliberateness that suggested he understood what kind of document required oilcloth. When he finished, he set them on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. "Your father sent this letter," he said. It was not quite a question. "There is no reply in the recess," she said. "He may not have sent it. He was very ill by the time he dated it." "There is a surveyor in the county seat," Olen said. "Fenton. He is not Alt's man. He did considerable work for the railroad, and the railroad is not friendly to Alt's interests in this county." She wrote to Fenton the following morning. She explained the discrepancy in plain terms, named the documents she held and the initials at 3 survey stations that Olen Bates could corroborate from memory, and asked whether a comparison of the original filed plat with the Alt revision would be possible through the county land office records. She did not ask him to believe her account before he had examined the evidence. She asked him to look. Fenton came to Calder's Crossing 12 days later. He was a man in his late 40s with a transit case and a deliberate manner of moving through the world that suggested he had looked at its measurements carefully and found most of them wanting correction. He examined the documents at the mill's floor, where Della spread them in the afternoon light from the east window. He examined the hoop recess in the runner stone with the lamp Della held for him, running his finger along the pin hinge with the expression of a man who appreciated the engineering of a hiding place that had been maintained for a decade by the very property of stone that made it ideal for grinding. He said that a mill bill dressed to a 32nd of an inch would miss a seam like that in normal running, and that a dresser working from memory, rather than from careful attention to the feel of the return, would miss it even at close range. "My father taught me to feel the stone," Della said. Fenton went to the county seat and requested the original plat and the Alt revision from the land office records. He laid them side by side on the land office table and measured the river boundary line on each, using the same instrument at the same scale. The discrepancy was 7/8 of an inch at the scale of the original filing, which translated to 12 feet and 3 inches on the ground. The river boundary on the Alt revision had been redrawn, not traced from the original, and the redrawing had removed the strip above the flood mark entirely, absorbing it into the riparian boundary where it carried no separate property status and could not be claimed as upland. The land office clerk, a man named Howell, who had accepted the Alt filing in 1880 and had not compared it to the original because the filing had arrived through a registered land agent with proper instruments of conveyance, went pale and then very still when Fenton showed him the 2 maps together on the same table. He was not a dishonest man. He had been, at the moment the revision was filed, a busy man who had trusted the instruments of legal procedure more than he had trusted his own verification, which was a failure of method rather than of character, but which produced the same practical result. He spent 2 full days after that pulling the chain of title on the Croft property and the surrounding parcels and cross-referencing the station initials from the original Aldous survey against the copy Thomas Croft had preserved in the mill recess. And at the end of those 2 days, he had a notation in the county record and a written report for the judge of the district court. Alt was not confronted. There was no confrontation to be had, and Della did not seek one. The county judge issued an order correcting the plat, restoring the 12-foot strip to the Croft deed that Della held, and noting the discrepancy between the original and revised filings as an irregularity requiring further examination by the district court. The examination took most of the winter. Alt's land agent, who had filed the revised plat in 1880 and who had since opened a real estate brokerage in Jefferson City, left that city before the first snow and was reported in the spring to have relocated to a different state. Alt himself retained a lawyer and made no public statements and did not appear in Calder's Crossing during the proceedings. His name appeared in the county court record as a respondent in a correction action, and there it remained as the examination concluded and the corrected plat was filed and the matter passed from active proceeding into the permanent record of how the land had actually been divided. The coal seam on the restored strip was not deep. It was not a bonanza of the kind that was transforming counties to the west of Missouri in those years. It was a narrow vein in the exposed limestone of the riverbank, perhaps 4 feet at its widest, running for the length of the strip before pinching into the rock and disappearing. But it was coal in 1883 in a part of Missouri where coal was hauled at considerable expense from operations far to the north. And when a mining company out of Jefferson City sent a man to assess it in the spring of 1884, he confirmed what Thomas Croft had estimated. The vein was recoverable, the quality was usable, and the access from the riverbank was practical. The fee Della received for the mining rights was not a fortune. It was sufficient. Sufficient to replank the millrace gate properly with white oak rather than salvage floorboards. Sufficient to rebuild the upper floor and brace the beams that had buckled over the failed north end roof. Sufficient to buy a new bolting cloth assembly and a sound hopper from a mill equipment dealer in Sedalia, and to have a competent wheelwright rebuild the overshot wheel with matched paddles of the right thickness and taper, hung with precision so the wheel ran without wobble through its full rotation. Sufficient to pay Olen Bates for 6 weeks of labor at a fair rate, and to carry Della through the first year of milling with enough margin that she could spend it on the mill rather than on survival. She dressed the stones again in March of 1884, this time as preparation rather than investigation. The spring melt filled the channel, and the rebuilt wheel turned with the authority of machinery that had been correctly made, and the runner stone began to move against the bed stone at the speed and gear ratio Thomas Croft had set into the drivetrain 30 years before. She opened the feed shoe on the first run with a measure of winter wheat she had bought from Olen Bates at the going rate, and listened to the sound the grain made coming through the eye of the stone and the sound the meal made coming out at the skirt, a fine hissing that she recognized from childhood. The flour was fine. She pressed a pinch of it between her fingers and felt no heat in it, no lumps, no slickness of a glazed and uncut surface. The harps were working. The grain was going through the way her father had said it would when the stone was dressed right, the meal falling clean and pale into the bin below. In the summer of 1884, the first farmers came back to the Croft mill with their wagons. They came quietly, one at a time without ceremony or stated apology, which was the only kind of coming around that Della found acceptable. Olen Bates brought the first wagon load himself before the mill had its full complement of equipment back, before the bolting cloth was fitted and the operation was producing wholemeal flour rather than the fine bolted grade he probably wanted for his household. He left the wagon at the mill door without knocking and went home, and Della ground his wheat through the morning and left the flour sacked and ready before dark so he could collect it early the following day. She found, tucked under the flour sack when she was hanging the tools, a folded piece of cloth. Inside it was a small iron wedge of the kind used for setting millstone balance, the sort of tool that migrated between mills and millers over the years, and accumulated provenance through use rather than through any formal ownership. She did not know if it was one she had seen before. She set it in the canvas bag beside her father's bill irons and did not say anything about it to Len when she saw him next, which was the practical form of acknowledgement available between two people who found sentiment easier to express through the handling of tools. The other farmers came as the summer progressed. Cord Webb from the eastern township with his winter wheat. The Haas brothers from the Ridge farm with rye and a broken wagon pin they asked her to advise on, which she did by pointing at the livery in town without comment. A widow named Prager who had been grinding her own grain by hand since the Alt mill had moved its operation north, and who arrived with a small sack of corn and the expression of someone who had been waiting to see if the Croft mill would actually run before committing to a wagon trip. It ran. She came back the following month with twice the corn and no expression in particular, which Della understood as confidence. By the autumn of that year, the mill log Della kept, a new brown ledger she had bought from the dry goods store where she had once rented a room, showed 23 customers for the season, not the volume of her father's best years. Enough to make the operation sound. She dressed the stones in September as her father's log said they should be dressed, spring and autumn, and she worked the outer quarter of the runner stone with the same attention she gave every session, feeling the return through the bill handle, checking the lands with the rinding staff and the proving ring, listening to the way the stone rang under the bill to tell her whether she was cutting true or catching an angle. On the second afternoon of that September dressing, at the same spot on the outer quarter where she had found it the year before, she paused with the bill in her hand and felt the familiar, different resistance in the stone's face, and then let her palm rest there for a moment. The panel was still in place, the pin hinge still held. She did not open it. She set her palm on it the way she might set her palm on a door to feel whether there was warmth on the other side. And then she picked up the bill and continued the dressing and finished it as the afternoon light left the stone's face. The mill ran through the harvest of 1884 and through the following 3 seasons without stopping for more than routine maintenance and the replacement of 2 paddles after a high water event in the spring of 1885. The wheel turned. The stone dressed true. The flour came out cool and clean and fine enough that Cord Webb told her once, not looking at her but at the sack he was lifting onto his wagon, that his wife had said it was better than what Alt's roller mill had ever produced, which was a thing he would not have said a year ago and which he said now without much fanfare. As if it were simply a measurement he had taken and was reporting accurately. Della said she would tell the stones. He looked at her then with the uncertainty of a man not sure if he was being made fun of, and she handed him his bill of meal, and he went home and she went back into the mill and ran the next measure through. The survey map that Fenton had used in his comparison hung now in the land office as part of the corrected plat record. Della had received her father's original back when the proceedings concluded, and she had put it in the canvas tool bag beside the mill bills. It lived there now between the honest measure and the proving ring, pressed flat by the weight of the other tools, its papers still sound under the oilcloth that had preserved it through 10 years in the dark interior of a millstone. The recess in the runner stone's banding hoop remained as Thomas Croft had made it. She left the panel in place and closed on its hinge. It did not interfere with the stone's function in any way she had ever been able to measure. It was invisible to anyone who had not been shown it, and who did not know how to dress millstone to the 64th of an inch. She supposed it would remain invisible. And she supposed that was as Thomas had intended, a place that could only be found by the one person he had taught to feel what the stones said through the handle of a mill bill. The mill bill that had found it hung on the nail beside the door, the same nail her father had used. Handle was worn to the shape of a hand that was not hers, but that she had grown into over 30 years of occasional use, the wood dark with oil at the grip and lighter at the end where it had been set down on stone surfaces 10,000 times. She hung it there each time she finished dressing, and it hung there, between sessions, gathering the particular dust that settled on everything near the stones. A fine pale coating that caught the morning light and made even old iron look like something worth keeping. If you know what it is to inherit a skill that no one around you values until the moment it is the only thing that matters, leave a word below. And when you are ready for another story about a woman and the thing she opened that the world had decided to throw away, there is one waiting for you.